Welcome to Dumbledore's Army, a book club and discussion group where we talk about books. This week, we're talking about the African American experience in children's literature.
And do we want to share the books that we'll be looking for?
Yeah,
We're
we should.
focusing on
So we have Unspoken. It's a wordless picture book by Henry Cole.
We have
Happy to Be Nappy by Bell Hooks and Chris Roshka.
Yummy, The Last Days of a Southside Shorty by G. Neary.
Drowned City, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, written and illustrated by Don Brown.
We have another graphic novel, March, by John Lewis.
Honey, I Love and Other Poems by Eloise Greenfield.
I
And
think
Night
that's the
John
last-
by Gary Paulson. And Frederick's Journey, The Life of Frederick Douglass by Doreen Rappaport and illustrated by London Ladd. So with that set of books, this is just a small representation of African American experience. There's so much more, but this is the set we selected to kind of represent different eras in time. And so there are historical events and cultural events represented, but also just normal everyday life experience.
We're thinking about the TED Talk, The Danger of the Single Story by,
Chimamanda Adichie.
and one of the quotes, or something that she points out in the TED Talk, she questions or asks, what happens when complex human beings and situations are reduced to a single narrative? And it encourages incomplete and potentially damaging narratives or storylines. So I think that's a good conversation for us to start off, looking across our collection and thinking about us as complex human beings, but what happens when we only view a culture or history or time and space through one lens, right, and one view of the world. So if our collection only, let's start us off, if our collection only contained stories that were about the Civil War, told through the story, or told through the eyes, the lens of predominantly white people during that time, in the time of slavery, telling the story of other people and the experience of slavery through their own perspective, then if we only had that one story, we would have an incomplete knowledge of that time and space.
Right, so looking at books that do tell the book about Frederick Douglass, where we take a different look. We often think of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, but Frederick Douglass is a very powerful, important person in the Civil War and in the rights of African Americans. And so understanding what he went through and his experiences adds a different lens to our collective experience of understanding the world in time and in place.
And we also have Unspoken, which is a wordless book on the story from the Underground Railroad, told through the eyes of one little girl during that time period, who, looking at it, it was just taking place in Virginia.
I believe so.
Yeah, somewhere up north, because judging the illustrations, you can see the trees and the type of fauna that representative, probably like south Virginia.
But we have her own perspective of, as a young white female during that time, who then is looking upon the corn stalks and notices somebody hiding. And although it's not stated throughout, we can read the images and we assume that that's a slave that's hiding.
Yeah, and it's interesting because of this fact that you can only see this person's eye.
The entire time, that's right.
And I think that also suggests that first person, that do I see myself in this person, or what does this eye represent? But I think Henry Cole does an amazing like telling the story through without words, and kind of looking at this girl's like facial expression and her moving through the story and how things changing around and how she becomes like an advocate for this person and giving.
If we look at her eyes, so on the page there where she's walking into the night, that she's going back out to the barn, the eye, if her eyes were faced forward, it would give us a different
Yes.
message than her eyes kind of
Looking
looking
back,
back,
yeah.
Mhm.
which shows a level of worry and concern. And then her grip that she has on the package, where at this point in the story we don't even know that is a package. We just are looking at what's happening. But then you realize later that she's got something that she's delivering.
And you also realize that if you look carefully, like all the other people in the story, like their eyes is always closed. Like even when they are praying or when they are doing something, their eyes never open. Only this one little girl's eyes open and the person who is hiding. So-
Exactly. So what is that?
You know
There's
what, I never
another.
noticed that before.
I never
Really?
had either. So there's another layer to the story
Yeah.
there, and understanding
Almost like, are they keeping
metaphorically,
purposely?
she's
Yeah.
got her eyes
Yes,
wide
what
open.
happens
Yeah.
when you're awakened?
She's
and you-
woke.
Yes,
Yeah.
she's woke, and everybody else is sleeping. And you can even see, if you look at the soldiers at the beginning, like she's kind
She's
of
still
downcast,
partially asleep, yes?
and all the eyes are, you cannot.
You can't
see
even make
any,
out any other
yeah,
faces
any other
of the soldiers.
any other open eyes except like when even here when.
This is almost like they
you're
were starting
here,
to.
But they are staring into like this vague space.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, I guess with their expressions, so their
Mhm.
eyes are open, but they're still.
Their expression is
Expressionless.
downtrodden.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I never noticed that.
yeah. And then from the eye of the person that's hiding, you cannot tell gender.
No.
I mean, I've
Nope.
had some people interpret that it's a woman because there's a doll, but
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean that person hiding is a doll, is a woman or man.
You know, it's funny
There's no
that
indication.
when I read that, I assumed it was a man because the only story that I typically hear is the men escaping, and that's what you would normally get, Night
Yeah.
John, right?
So Nightjohn, exactly.
Yeah.
Nightjohn is a connected text to this
Yeah.
book in the
Mhm.
same way, because you think of this slave coming back into the South for the purpose of helping others.
Right.
What's the background of the story of this singular person hiding in this barn?
Yep.
In my mind, I made the connection that could be Nightjohn.
Yeah.
It could be a woman. It could be a child. We really don't know.
Yeah, we have
There's
no idea.
kind of understanding there.
But again, I think all these books are asking something from the reader, like are we willing to step into the place of this little girl who notices someone and goes from being scared and terrified into like a helper, someone who like assists this person, because that's I think one question. Why are we reading these books and look at our like political situation and our views on refugees, like are we willing to do the same thing? Because it's not just about the Civil War era and slavery, but I think it's about how we relate to that person who is hiding.
Mm-hmm. True.
Or can we open our eyes like this little girl? And that's what I love about children's literature, because I don't see it as this is literature for children, because I think we also have so much to take away from it and so much to discuss and talk and even relate through these books.
And every person's reading is layered with their own life experience, their understanding of
So,
culture.
3 of us got something different from that,
Mhm.
even though we, the general understanding of it, but still noticed different things about that text as we read.
Right.
Yeah.
And then in a book like Nightjohn, which is much more explicit
Mm-hmm.
about the experience of slaves, and that you could say Unspoken is a watered down version of the
Yes.
experience. It doesn't really tackle.
Mm-hmm.
A child may not understand when those people come with a poster
What is?
of what the outcome could be if
Right.
that
Yeah.
person is found.
Mhm.
But this book is an explicit discussion
Mhm.
of the treatment of slaves,
Mhm.
with forced breeding, with violence on people that didn't conform, on the risks that it took to escape, on the way they relied on each other, the lack of education. The point of Nightjohn coming back is to teach slaves to read, and not understanding that one bit of power was so, it was outlawed.
Mhm.
Slaves could not read, because understanding if they could read, they get power.
Right.
Yeah, and I think like another connection I see between Nightjohn and Unspoken, that like Henry Cole is kind of conjuring up this story through images, but Gary Paulson does that through just words only.
Yep.
There are
Yes.
no illustrations,
None.
and the words like create this vivid imagery that suddenly becomes like part of our collective memory. Like now we can
Yes.
see it and hear the voices.
Right.
So that's an interesting contrast.
And when I read Nightjohn in the 90s, let's say,
Mhm.
well before Unspoken was ever written, when I read Unspoken, I immediately thought of Nightjohn. He is part of my life.
Mhm.
I know him as a person,
Yes.
even though I don't know him as a person and he didn't actually exist. He's fiction, but he's real to me.
Yeah, fiction. It's like this again, this question of truth and fiction. You know, that we have these stories, and you know, Unspoken might never happen this way, but for us as a reader, it becomes a reality.
This could be a whole other conversation for another time, but it makes me think of the author then that wrote this and to
Oh,
create
right.
such
Yes.
a powerful character and to be able to tell that experience, yet we're looking at a white man.
Exactly.
And
that's
who
the
has
whole
written
point.
multiple incredible books that we remember. But this one in particular just struck me that prior to this, I probably wouldn't have thought of who was writing the stories, what perspective is that coming from. Yeah, but it still sits with you. And even there are some illustrations in here that
Yes.
I remember that.
by,
Yeah,
by illustrators who are African American.
right.
So the interesting portrayals of who gets to tell whose story, yeah, maybe it's a conversation for another time, or maybe it's a conversation for right now.
Right.
There is that issue of, does Gary Paulson, a
Mhm.
white man, get to tell the story of slavery? He didn't live with that as part of his childhood.
Mhm.
It's not a history, it's not his family history, but does he get to do it?
So I think there are, you know, both arguments for and against it, but I always felt that, like, what he does is demonstrating that through empathy, research, and relating to an experience that wasn't his own, he's kind of growing into this more whole person. Like he's gaining more integrity, and I'm sure that he relates so differently to the African American experience because he's actually putting all this energy and talent and effort into writing, creating a story.
And understanding it.
Yeah. So
But in contrast, you
Mhm.
have Bell
Yeah.
Hooks, an African American woman and well-known feminist, black feminist, writing a book about nappy hair.
yes.
If a white man wrote nappy hair, what would happen?
Hmm.
Is a white man allowed to write the story where we talk about
And could they probably
a halo?
capture the feelings or the understanding of what that means? I mean, I couldn't, I don't have that understanding. So I don't know if I could write a book that really captures the beautiful language of it, even how she describes, like what you used to saying, a halo, a crown, but I'm not sure I would get the same impression.
Yeah, but I think we have to mention that the illustrator is a white person, so it
Yes,
becomes like
well,
this
right.
nice pairing of
Oh, right. The
words and
illustrator, Chris
illustration.
Roshka, is white.
Yes.
Yeah.
From Michigan.
Mhm.
You know, he just doesn't have that same experience, but he captures the illustrations.
Yes.
And in a very playful way, in contrast to the illustrations of, let's say, Honey, I Love,
Mhm.
or Frederick Douglass,
Mhm.
where have a more realistic portrayal of people.
It is,
This-
but I see the whole project as kind of a hopeful representation of what we could become if we come together and share experiences, but you know, kind of combining our talents and telling stories, even coming from very different backgrounds and very different experiences. So there is, I think, children's literature is kind of like this place where people come together from very different backgrounds and collaborate and create truly aesthetic and beautiful stories.
I would say this was a collaboration just by the two of them, because I know you mentioned in the past that there's not always that connection or collaboration
Right.
between the author and
The
illustrator.
person writes and the
depending on
illustrator
who they
draws.
are and how much
Right,
yes.
exactly, right.
Or a little bit there, I don't know. But I would say the two of them probably did, and I'm assuming that Bell Hooks would not have
We could
given
look
her
that
stamp
up.
of approval
We could look that up,
on
and
that.
I would
Yes.
imagine
Yes.
Bell Hooks had the power to
Yes.
Oh,
say,
I'm
I
sure
would
she
say
did.
which
so.
is another interesting
Yeah.
point of who gets the power to tell
Yes.
whose stories,
Yes.
right? And would a book about nappy hair get published if it wasn't written by someone as important as Bell Hooks?
Right.
So,
or would it be just dismissed because her name carries so much weight, you know?
I was drawn to it by the fact that it's Bell Hooks.
Yes,
Yeah.
me too. That's,
Also by the fact it's Chris Roshka.
Mhm.
Right.
So, similarly, the other books in our collection here, I was drawn to March because of John Lewis.
Mhm.
In my, I went to the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., but also in just looking at the Selma, the anniversary of Selma,
Mhm.
and watching John Lewis cross the bridge next to Barack Obama, I still get
Yeah.
chills when I think about the fact that what this man went through and the experience of almost being killed
Mhm.
just to vote,
Yeah.
to get registered to vote. And I've seen images, large images of Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King leading marches, and I just look at them and think, I don't know that I have the guts.
Hmm.
You know they were under death threat. You know death threat as the most extreme. Dogs, fire hoses, rocks, bottles, and all the other things. You know, physical harm. But they also are under threat of losing their jobs. Maybe not Martin Luther King necessarily, but other people that were participating were under threat. And I don't know. I'd like to think I would, but I don't know. And when I went to the March for Your Lives in Washington, D.C., with my daughter, I told her, there could be some violence that happens in this crowd. If we get separated, you worry about yourself, I will find you. You know, those are the kinds of things that I thought of, and I'm a white person in a city where I don't have to really worry about the color of my skin. I'm just worried about gun violence in the middle of a a violence demonstration. So just doing that, it scared me. And what they faced was such a greater threat to their lives. I don't know how they did it consistently, you know, and just seeing it in their face. So I love looking at a book like March, thinking about John Lewis, thinking about knowing him now as a senator, and his experience to have watched how far we've come, but still how far we have to go. He said that many times. It's just an amazing book to me.
I think the graphic novel format is also like serves an invitation to step into the story and kind of
Yes.
experience it not just through words but through the images, and how like the artist structures like the scenes and how he breaks up like, you know, the emphasis, you know, there's
Yes.
so much darkness and light and the contrast.
Exactly.
So I think you can spend, you know, several days just going through this book and looking at from in different ways and focusing on images or the words, and like it's kind of an endless reading experience.
It is an endless reading experience. And anything new that you bring to it, for example, your comment about the eyes in Unspoken, let's look at the eyes in March. What is happening? What are people's faces telling us? Or their hands, the gestures that they use. And you know, the illustrators pay very careful attention to these kinds of things. This is all deliberate.
So it calls us to like stop and don't rush through like a story. It really like forces you to kind of slow down and make sense of it, because you're not only dealing with like words, but you have images, and I think we have to kind of train our eyes to understand that, you know, the words play a role and the illustration plays a role, and they are complementary and not just simply like illustrative. Like I think they have equal importance.
And the reason why I like Yummy and March and Drown City, all three graphic novel style, are because all of them don't hide the fact of, or don't dumb down or minimize what the characters are feeling or what happened during that point in time. All of them very different points in time and different parts of history throughout the U.S. But it is what you were saying earlier about in your face, or like Nightjon, and even Drowned City, the way that they describe what was happening during the hurricane during that time, watching people drown around them, and just the fear, the bugs,
Right.
the you know what was happening
Yes.
in the bodies. But it's not something that what we talked about Unspoken, which we could read into it as
Yes.
adults, but maybe not as somebody younger really understand what was happening. But it's clear from
It's
the
very
images,
clear.
from the
Exactly.
language, and what was happening, especially in Yummy. So
Yeah.
Yummy I appreciated for a whole different reason, something that we've seen in the news and something that's come up even recently, where you can read what happened to this young child and
Like,
yeah.
we are talking about this one isolated story. We
Right.
know that this is actually going on in many American cities
Yes.
today.
Mhm.
So it it becomes a narrative that kind of helps us to awaken and
Oh.
open our eyes.
Yes, of gun violence and
Yes.
what's happening now.
Right.
Yeah. Even in Chicago, that this,
Mhm.
I don't remember what year this was. I mean, that's been,
1992.
it's been that many years.
What does it
But they're
say?
still having these same
1994.
conversations in Chicago
Of course.
about what to do about gun violence and what happens to youth and young adults.
Well, some of the things that the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas kids have discussed is we are bringing attention to this issue that Black America has faced for decades.
Yes, yep.
Of the disproportionate number of Black kids that are killed in neighborhoods just walking to school or
Young
going
males,
to church.
yeah.
And males.
Yeah.
And the school to prison pipeline and the
Mhm.
issues that just have not received the attention that it needs to have. One of the things in selecting these books is coming to books like Honey, I Love, which in contrast to Yummy, which does deal with a very real issue of racial profiling, gun violence, and poverty, is you have a book of poetry that is about love and
Yes.
hope and family and connection and all the different ways that you can relate to someone. It is about the African American experience. And I love this book.
Yeah. Because there are like some aspects of love that I never experienced it as growing up in Eastern Europe in a white family. Like the things that she kind of explains falling in love with and incites these feelings, I never even had those. So it's like my idea of love is expanding because now those experiences are also part of it. Because someone else kind of opens up this door and say, hey, this is love too.
Mhm.
And for me, love has this color or this smell. And that's beautiful. I
Right,
think.
yeah. And some of the things that are powerful for me, growing up very close to my own grandmother,
Mhm.
for example, in the poem Keepsake,
Mhm.
you can tell there's an intergenerational connection. She's talking about before Mrs. William died, she told Mr. Williams when he gets home to get a nickel out of her pocketbook,
Mhm.
her navy blue pocketbook, and give it to her sweet little gingerbread girl. That's me. I ain't never going to spend it.
Mhm.
And to keep a nickel, just a little
Yes.
nickel, to know that she has a
Mhm.
navy blue pocketbook,
Yeah.
an intimacy that is there that I imagine they lived in an apartment complex,
Mhm.
right, where you have many different families. That's where you would know that you're inside someone else's space, and there's a lot of messaging there about the way people live that is not. I grew up with my grandmother in a different house, but I just see there's an intimacy of knowing the clothing, the purse,
Yeah.
All those details of a person.
and the tiny little
Yeah.
way it said before she died, she told Mr. Williams, and she didn't know she was dying, but she still had that nickel,
Mhm.
right? She knew it was very
I love
special.
the images, but I mean, there's so
Yes.
much there as well that tells a
I
story.
really like
yeah.
this version with these
Yeah, I do
illustrators.
too.
Yeah, Diane and Leo Dillon.
And also, like for us, like reading, these poems, particularly this poem, it's kind of like reminds us about like smallest things
Yes.
in life that we don't really pay attention, but how like it can be endowed with so much meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And like for this, like reading this poem, you won't see the nickel the same way as you
Exactly.
saw it previously. So I think
Exactly.
that's the beauty of it. That after reading this poem, like everything will have a different meaning, even
Yeah.
the small, like insignificant objects.
Mhm. So I think some of the big takeaways of our discussion are the idea of children's literature is not just for children, that we bring our own personal lives and experiences into the readings.
Mhm.
Every time we read it, it's something different. We could see something, we could read something different, and it affects how we make sense of it.
Yeah, and it kind of ties in with the initial quote we quoted from Chimamanda, that Professor Bishop in Mirrors, Windows and Sliding Glass Doors writes that when children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn powerful lessons about how they are devalued in the society of which they are part. So I think like these books actually examples that, you know, representations can be like beautiful, and it doesn't have to be like comical or like something that would, you know, create these stereotypes. I mean, and I think that's another discussion, that what makes a book quality book. You know, when we select book, like how do we
Right.
look at illustration? What illustration is artistic or aesthetic or
And not to
meaningful?
avoid those taboo topics or discussions
Right.
of what's happened in the past
Mhm.
and what's happening now.
Yes.
Because we, as you said earlier, what's happening are the themes
Like
that we're
how we
finding
represent
are,
people,
Yes.
a dominant culture, how we represent people, others,
Right.
namely.
Right.
Join us next
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
This is Dumbledore's Army, signing off.